Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for listening. We are here today with Helen Keeling-Neal, our dear friend and also colleague. She is a licensed marriage and family therapist, licensed mental health counselor with a private practice in Winter Park, Florida, and an all-around fabulous human being. And we're in for a real treat today because even though it's a difficult subject matter, it's one that's really important to discuss. Helen lost her husband at an unexpectedly young age and has found a way to move through grief and live her best life. And we really want you to hear about how she did that, what she's been through, in the hopes that it will help those of you who are dealing with something similar and maybe have friends and family going through that as well. So welcome, Helen. I'm going to shut up now and I want to turn over the floor to you a little bit.
It's good to be here. I think this is a really important topic, no matter what age you lose someone at. For me, I was 42 and my kids were 4 and 6. David was 10 years older than me, and it was very quick, it was very sudden. We'd known something was going on. We thought it was maybe to do with his stomach and had him checked out at the gastroenterologist and things like that. And 3 months later, he was in chronic liver failure. So he had liver cancer.
Wow.
Yes. And so we actually, from when we found that out, he went into the hospital and never came out. He ended up passing away in hospice, but it was about 2.5 weeks. And then he was gone.
What?
Yeah. Yeah. So it was
Wow.
very quick, very shocking, very powerless place to be. Yeah, super fast. And it's a long time ago. Clearly, I'm not 42 anymore. But
Well, you
that
look it.
journey, oh yeah, thank you.
How many years ago was that at this point?
2009, so it's coming up on 15.
Wow. So a 15-year journey of, I mean, take us into like how you process that just initially. I mean, obviously it's so unexpected.
Well, you don't process it initially. You go into survival mode or shutdown mode or numb mode or mum mode. I went into mum mode. My kids were so little, they were attached to him, and so that's what I had to do. That kind of loss, and any loss, especially when you have kids, it's like you're not just losing your husband, but you're losing an income. You're losing the guy who cuts the lawn. You're losing bedtime story dad and the person who grills in the family and the second set of eyes and all of this. So it's like this loss across the board that you don't even think about until it happens.
I'm just even listening to you. I've known you all these years, and I did not know the story of what happened or just how sudden it was, how young your children were. And for this to all transpire within a period of about 2 weeks, were you just in shock for a long period of time? Or, I mean, how do you even get through the day when this first occurs?
Yeah, I this might sound kind of harsh, but I think after someone passes away or is in the process of a sudden tragic thing like this, there's like you go into the business of death. It's like you
Yeah.
have to handle the business of it, the logistics, for me as somebody who wanted to really take care of my kids, and the way the story went, when he went into the hospital, they told me originally 18 months, and then they assessed him again. They said probably about 12 months, and then a couple of days later, they said, no, we're looking at about 6 to 9 months, and then they told me he's got about 8 weeks, and then they said, and this was all in the space of a few days, he's probably got about 7 days, and that's how quickly that happened. So I had to set in place, and I feel grateful that I was able to do this, the things that we might need. So I'd already went to New Hope for Children Grieving Family because I knew I was going to need that as a resource for my kids. I was already reaching out to family because I don't have any family in town, things like that. So I went into business mode, logistics mode. You got the funeral, the service, and you're dealing with a lot of people who are super kind. And, there's jokes about the endless lasagnas and stuffed shells, and it's true.
Right.
But it's
Yeah.
also delightful. And I got to feed some neighbors with that because there was so much food and so much care. So it's not really, I think, until later in the quiet moments which are really hard to allow, that the real
Yeah.
grief starts to process. And that can be years later for people. I think about 6 months later, things got quieter. People weren't calling as much. That's when, I would be curled up on the floor sobbing. And my kids just, oh, it was heartbreaking. The older one, who was 6, knew much more. My kids were really tuned in, and just grieved so loudly. And the younger one, she didn't know she was grieving. So she would get so upset. And this was a 4-year-old who didn't have tantrums. And hadn't since she was around 2, who would kick the door in her room so hard she cracked the wall because she was so upset that they didn't have blueberry flavored Italian ice. Now we both know, we all know,
Wasn't the Italian
it
ice,
wasn't
huh?
the Italian ice, and so having to deal with that that's when you put your own grief aside. That's when you can't
Right.
and make an income and
Yeah.
keep the house tight and do the laundry and keep their schedule as normal as possible, bedtimes and story and school and all of that. It comes in pods and it's completely non-linear, and we all we know the stages of grief, and I think you can have all of them at once, so you can have one and then can be a big gap, and the things to look out for are don't dive into substance use and another relationship.
Yeah.
Really important.
Did you have anyone to support you? Like, does family come and stay with you or rally next to you, or are you like alone with these small children for the bulk of this journey?
But first, I had a lot of support, and and I have to say that as someone who is used to being the supporter, I had to really adjust my mindset around that and learn how to receive. And I'm very big on working with my clients on receiving and encouraging people to ask. And when people say, "What can I do?" "Oh, I'm fine. I'm good." Be specific. And also, something that's important to know is you don't know what you need sometimes in the event of that. So having someone say, "Hey, I'm going to bring you some food. I'm going to drop it off on your doorstep. Don't worry, you can freeze it," is great. But as far as support, I had an amazing community where I lived. A lot of really, really strong friends. My mom flew in from England and was here for a couple of weeks. And my good friend Molly came into town, and David's family came into town. But then everybody goes away after a couple of weeks.
Yes, this is what I hear people talk about. Who my really dear friend just lost her father. And obviously it's a different situation. He was an older man, but they still were not prepared for it at all. And a lot of what you're saying reminds me of what she said. So I think this conversation is important for everyone who's
Yeah.
lost anyone in their life. That, at first I love your phrase, the business of death, that you have to function. And so maybe you're not even in shock yet, or you're certainly not in the stages of grief yet, because there's just so much to do
Yeah.
that has to be accomplished. You don't even have the luxury of feeling your feelings. And then it's not till, I've heard other people and clients talk about this, that after somebody passes, there's all these people around you, and then people go back to their normal lives. And that's when you're alone and you have the space to sit with the enormity of what's happened, and it begins to sink in.
Yes.
So it makes a lot of sense. But I think if you haven't been through it, and I haven't been through it, knock on wood, with anyone so close to me, I can't imagine how hard that must be when it begins to sink in.
Yes.
So what kind of things, when you're saying don't go to substance abuse, don't get involved with someone else, and I can see how tempting both of those things would be, what are some of the things you did that helped you cope when it began to sink in and you started feeling your feelings?
Well, therapy. Therapy is huge. EMDR, really helpful. I tried to live a normal life. With that kind of loss, it just wakes you up into this kind of crass, but it's like, what the fuck kind of circumstance where
Yes.
everything else seems small in comparison. So the things that might have been a big irritation before, it just goes away because it's like, well, nobody died today. And honestly, that's my mantra. Nobody died today. I'm in recovery, so I went to recovery meetings. I would raise my hand and say, I'm a high risk. I'm a high risk. And, so that I could get through this sober and be present for my kids.
Yeah.
Having close friends that you can sit and cry with, that can hold that space for you and not need to make you feel better.
Rescue you from it.
Yes, yes. But there comes a stage where, like, I wanted to be able to do that, right? To vent it out when it came up. But grief is like a sneaky bitch because it blindsides you just at the most inopportune moments. And I remember about 11 months after David died, I went on a date. Right? It was a nice date, went for dinner, gave him a hug goodbye, and he had the wrong cologne on. The smell was the wrong smell. I went home and I cried for 3 days.
Ugh.
You just never think about things like that, what that's going to be like.
It's not your person. And it all of a sudden that grief just comes surging up.
Another thing I did, I went to Grief Share. I don't know if you've heard of Grief Share.
No, what's grief share?
It is done through a church, and I'm not a particularly churchy person, but I met this lovely lady who was an older lady, and she said, why don't you come to Grief Share? And it's to help process grief. And it's non-denominational. And that was really helpful because everybody in the room had lost someone, and that was really good. And then New Hope for Grieving Children and Families, because the parents would have their own session while the kids had their sessions.
Oh, that's amazing.
That's great.
So you really recommend, and it makes sense to me as a therapist, like the shared experience of being with others who are going through something similar, that's an
Yes.
important component, I would think, of healing.
Huge. Yes.
Yeah. I have a client doing that right now. She lost her dad unexpectedly, and it's a huge help. Let me ask you, Helen. I'm assuming, like, having young kids, were you working at the time, or were you like a stay-at-home mom?
So I was working part-time, just doing some business consulting and teaching mommy and me art classes. So I
Oh.
was consulting for an art studio called My Art Studio. And we'd been through a lot of difficulties because it was the recession. David had lost his job. There was a lot of stuff going on. So we're in a very financially difficult position. And so I actually had to get a full-time job immediately after he passed away. So it was about 3 weeks later, I was working full-time.
What did you
Wow.
decide to do? Like, what did you find in terms of full-time work in that moment?
Yes, well, I'm very grateful because the art studio had wanted me to come on as director previously, but I'd said no, so I went on full-time as the director for my art studio and had a full-time after-school program and field trips and things like that. That was a real gift for me because I was able to leave, pick up my kids, and bring them back to the studio because my priority was my kids.
Yeah.
But I had to make a decision, and this is a decision which is a difficult one to make. I had to make a decision to not make a very high income because I needed to be really present for my kids. I could have gone into, 3+ figure position, but chose less because of the time and flexibility I needed. And that was a really difficult thing. It meant I lost the house that I lived in and had to move into a smaller house. But I did that on purpose because I needed to not have that be so overwhelming, the overhead be so overwhelming that I would just have nothing for my kids and would be working like 50, 60 hours a week.
Right. You needed to prioritize your time with the kids and balance that in the decision. And I wonder, Helen, as we're all three therapists here, and for our listeners who may be grieving the loss of someone, or surely it's something we're all going to face at some point. I have seen many clients over the years, before I decided to only do couples therapy in particular, who would move through the stages of grief and come to some resolution. And then those who would, not resolution, but acceptance. And then those who would really get stuck in the grief and not progress. And one of the things I've noticed, and I'm curious your take on this, is that many of those who were able to successfully move through the grief and come to acceptance created a narrative of what happened that they could live with. And doesn't mean that it minimized the pain, but they found a way to make sense of and come to terms with it. Did you have to develop some, because I would imagine that you're, how does this happen to me? How could this have happened? Especially when it's a tragic, untimely thing. Did you have to come up with some kind of narrative that explained why this occurred or to help you live with the unthinkable?
I really didn't, but I'm a little different in that way personally. I'm very
Yeah.
much a sort of living in alignment kind of person.
Can you explain what that means too? Can you explain what living in alignment means?
So, I don't go to why did this happen? I go to more, this sucks that this happened. This isn't fair that it happened, but it did happen. What do I need to do now to move through it?
Did you feel sorry for yourself though? Was there strong feelings of like, why me?
I think the feelings didn't come in the thought of why me, they came in complete overwhelm.
Yeah.
Like, it's not fair to be so overwhelmed. Like, that's not okay. I have a lot of things I went through early childhood and things like that too that made life very difficult for me. So I think I was like, what? This is not fucking fair.
Yeah.
So it's more anger, really.
Too much for one person's life.
But then on the other side, but it is what it is. And therefore,
Right.
what am I going to do and how am I going to handle it and how I'm going to move through it? And I want to talk to that getting stuck. I'm pretty convinced that getting stuck piece is related to compound grief and attachment.
Bit more about that.
Yeah.
Yes, Panksepp, the neurologist, he talks about the 7 affect networks, and one of them is panic/grief, which is the
Yes.
abandonment, the loneliness, and those kind of elements. And so, what I see, and certainly with some of my experiences, if you've lost someone significant earlier, or if you have an attachment wound from an unavailable or non-present or non-emotionally present caregiver, you can get stuck in an aspect of yourself that is looping the grief that seems like it's about this loss, but it isn't. It's an earlier attachment wound or an earlier loss.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. That makes perfect sense. And when I think about the clients who come to mind, that makes sense with their attachment history as well. So, in the case of the point you're bringing up for somebody listening, this is where going to therapy is really going to be important.
Really important, right? Because it's hard to parse apart. Because I had some of that too, because I lost my dad when I was younger, and there's a lot of stuff, right? So it feels so huge, it feels insurmountable. And so
Yeah.
a good therapist can help you with some EMDR or ART or whatever, modality that works for you to really kind of pull that apart so you can process this and then process this and process this.
It sounds like you did a lot of work prior though.
I did.
You've mentioned EMDR twice and now art, and our listeners, most of them probably don't know what those things are. Can you just give a very top line explanation? Because somebody going through grief may want to look for a therapist in their area who does these modalities that are so helpful. So, do you want to just share a little more about what those are and why they're so effective?
Yes, EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization reprocessing. And so it's a way using bilateral movements, whether it's tapping or tracking with your eyes, to process the trauma in connection with the grief and loss. So a lot of times it's not pretty. The end of life can be not pretty and very traumatic to see. And
Yes.
so the way that you can do that is you can walk through releasing the stored trauma around the event and around the loss. And ART, I'm not trained in, but I know other people who are trained in it. It's accelerated resolution theory, I think. And
Therapy.
Therapy, thank you. And that's a similar process too.
Yes. Thank you, Helen. And I actually the practitioner in my office is trained in art, and I did 2 sessions with her, not on, on another kind of grief, a relationship grief.
Yeah.
And it's actually very similar to EMDR, which you and I are both trained in. And I do think it's worth saying, if you're going through something like this, the loss of a loved one, grief and trauma around that, EMDR or art therapy can help you move through it much more quickly and deeply, because when we talk things through, it's so valuable, but it's really more of a cognitive process. And when you get beneath all of that into the body more
Healing.
deeply and into those stored memories that are less conscious, it helps you, like you said, release some of that. So I think we all probably would suggest to any listeners that those therapies are worth looking into. And
Definitely.
at our website, insightsfromthecouch.org, we will include links to those therapies so you can look into that more thoroughly, as well as look for a therapist trained in those modalities in your area. I think that's really useful advice for people.
What was the beginning of the shifting out of this where you began to feel like I can raise these kids. I've got this. I'm healing. Like what was the journey through? I'm sure it's still going on, but in some
Yeah,
way.
because every developmental milestone, every mile marker for them and for me, there's an absence, right? So if it's starting first grade or second grade or graduating high school or going to college, so it's always going to be a loss there. But, the Queen Mother, she had this great saying, and it was, it doesn't get better, I get better at it. And she's talking about grief.
I love that.
I've seen often the image of a jar and it's packed full of stones, and that's grief. And then a next image will be it's a bigger jar, and so the pile of stones looks smaller. Um, Time really does heal, and if one's mindful of processing the emotions as they come up, allowing them to really come out. Often we do an even deeper healing when you get into another relationship. Like, you can't really do that loss if it's a significant other until you're in a love relationship that is really connected, because it just kicks up a whole ton of shit, a whole bunch of stuff.
Have you had that experience?
I've had that
Tell
experience.
us about that.
Yeah. I guess it was about maybe 18 months. I had a relationship that lasted about a year and 3 months, but I was never really fully in love with him. But in that relationship, I did some grieving. But then I didn't really have a very long term relationship for a number of years after that, for a long time. But 2.5 years ago, I met someone and I fell in love, and it was like, holy shit, terrifying, because
Really?
the thought was, what if I lose them again?
Yeah.
So all this stuff came up, and 2.5 years is not that long in a relationship. And then here's this piece of now bringing him into my family and my kids, and you, all that components. And it's really easy in some ways to just stay out of a relationship. I didn't want to bring a lot of people in and out. I didn't want to do a lot of dating because of my kids. So, but then I went a little bit the other way.
Have
Yeah.
you found that being in a committed relationship now, despite the fear, that it's brought a lot of healing?
It's great.
Oh, good. I'm so glad it's good. But
Yes.
does it still feel so wildly vulnerable, or have you worked through that?
I've worked through that. Yes.
So, and Helen, maybe there isn't one, but I'm just curious what you would say to somebody going through this. Like, do you see your own personal opinion kind of an ideal time to start I mean, obviously everyone's got to tune into themselves and when they feel ready, but are there any like do's and don'ts around getting into other relationships?
Well, I don't think there is an ideal time. Like, if you take somebody who is 70 years old and has maybe been with their partner for 50 years, and then that person may not even be able to be without a relationship, because
Yeah.
that has been what has fed them for so long. So, I see a lot of seniors will go more quickly into a relationship and, go for it. I think the things to look out for is, if you have children, you need to be cautious.
Because they've already lost someone.
Yes. And they don't expect them to attach to this new person. Don't, if you've fallen in love with this person, does not mean that they're going to. And so
Right.
there's a lot to navigate there. You do really need to be mindful about that. And and so that's why I don't do it so quickly. Be mindful of not using it to avoid the grief.
Your kids are
The
like adults by the time you fall in love, right?
Yes, yeah,
How did they
yeah.
receive your partner? Were they happy for you by that point? Like, come on, mom, you need to do this?
Yes, so
Yeah.
happy for me. So it was about 10 months after David died. My eldest, it was so heartbreaking. And she goes, Mommy, when am I going to get a new daddy? Oh, heartbreaking. She couldn't conceptualize not having a new dad, not having a dad. Could not. Just like, it was so heartbreaking.
Oh my God.
Yeah, you have to be aware of the wound that this creates for children. And especially 0 to 6, as far as attachment goes, there's a big old, like it's a wound, but it's a wound no matter what. But they do great. Yes, they're
That's
doing really well.
awesome.
And they're happy for you. That's amazing.
I love that. Oh, we
Yes.
skipped over like the whole part of this story where you build this career. So
Oh
that
yes,
happened.
yes,
And become a therapist.
yeah, yeah.
You really invested in you.
I did, but there were a lot of reasons that I went into therapy. I'd thought about it. I remember going to a Rollins information session with a 2-year-old and a newborn in tow. Like, and I'm thinking, oh no, I can't do this at this time. But after David died, I thought to myself, life needs to be done in a way that I want to do it. And what do I want to do? It had been,
Yes.
I thought about it for a long time, and I thought, well, what am I waiting for? Why am I waiting? You just literally don't know if you're going to be here tomorrow or if anybody else is going to be here tomorrow. Why
Yeah.
would I wait to move towards something? So I did. I applied and I got my master's and became licensed. And another reason I did, I had a very specific goal. I was going to go right into private practice. I needed to be able to manage my own work hours so that I could set my own schedule so I could be available for my kids. And everybody would say, you're going to have to work evenings. I said, I'm not working evenings. And I never did. I never worked evenings right from the get go.
Good for you.
I wanted to keep my kids a priority with that. There wasn't anybody else to be with them. It wasn't another family member, and it wasn't in the budget to have babysitters.
So you had to get right into action, and you did.
Mhm.
You
Yeah.
didn't have the luxury of just, collapsing and hiding in your bedroom. You had to be an active mother. You had to be an earner. There
Yes.
was really no option but to keep waking up every day and putting one foot in front of the other.
Yeah. Of course, I would collapse and hide in the bedroom or in collapse it. But yeah, you have to keep going.
You had to function.
Yeah.
And let's
Yeah.
just say how normal that is, the collapsing
Mhm.
in the bedroom. I mean, I still hear that with women who have gone through some terrible divorces that were not there. Like,
Yes.
just be at night collapsing
Yes.
and feeling hopeless and despair. And that's like part of the process.
I think it's really important to get that out, to have to be sobbing so hard that your pillow is wet. You need to do that.
Yeah.
Really important. If we store it, we're just gonna and it just turns into other stuff.
Oh my gosh, I agree so much. And actually, this is probably the perfect segue, what you're saying right now, as we wrap up the episode, to give some tips and takeaways for people going through grief of any kind. One that I hear you saying now is absolutely feel your feelings, give yourself permission, have that time to cry and stuff. You have to work through the emotions. And of course,
Yes.
you've also said going to therapy and maybe seeking something deeper than just talk therapy, even. What else would you say are your top tips for somebody going through grief?
Don't judge yourself in it. Stay away from that. I don't know why I'm crying, or it's been 6 months. I should be feeling better or doing better. Let yourself be angry. I think that's a really big part that we don't always allow. Let yourself be angry at the person for dying. Let yourself be angry at God. Let yourself be angry at the world or the disease or the person who created it or the car. Really let yourself be in that.
That's beautiful.
Be
Yeah.
mindful of guilt. make sure to work through any guilt. The times that I nagged him, or the times that I was like, why aren't you home and why are you working so much? Reflecting on and wishing I'd been kinder or more patient in things. So really turn a lens of kindness on yourself and understanding, and reach out to the people who can sit with big feelings, your friends and your family. And the other thing is, activate your play network. Do something fun.
Oh, I love
Go
that.
ride a roller coaster, go do whatever is fun for you that used to be fun you think may not even be fun. Try and push yourself to do it, because it will help.
Oh, that's a
Love that.
great suggestion, because I think sometimes people feel like they shouldn't be having any fun or shouldn't
Yeah.
be doing anything good. And it's so important to feel your big and sad and hurtful feelings, but also to go
Yeah.
live and not
And
beat yourself
laugh.
up for that. And then, of course, you also said earlier to some kind of support group. If you have children, perhaps they need that too if you've lost a spouse, but also for you, if you can find a local group at a church or someplace else with other people going through grief, that will really, really help. I mean, these are
Yeah.
such powerful, important takeaways. Anything else that you want to add? I certainly think this is enough, but I want to give you a chance if there's anything else that you feel like is really important.
I want to add something for the people who are supporting the person who's lost someone. One of the things that, a lot of times after some period of time, it was almost like my identity in my community became the person whose husband had died. And my kids,
Yeah.
it was the kids whose dad had died. And sometimes you just want to feel normal. So the pity eyes, whenever someone would see me, some people go right into the pity eyes. And I know that that's empathy, and I know that that's care. But sometimes you just want to be a person who is going to work or doing the laundry or making a dinner. And so take your cues from the person who's grieving.
It's good advice.
That's great advice. That's helpful for me to hear just as a person, because I think I'm one of those people who probably has the pity eyes and is trying to
You,
empathize. But sometimes you don't want to be living in the space
yeah.
of it every minute of every day.
Great stuff.
So helpful, and we're so happy to have had you. And we're going to give links to EMDR therapy, art therapy, and all that good stuff, so that if you're going through this or you know someone who is, you have solutions that can help. And I love, Helen, how you said, my favorite thing, it doesn't get better, I get better at it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's just a beautiful synopsis of the crazy and up and down process of grief, right? You've got to give it time.
And so glad to hear that you're so happy and your family is good. That's
And
awesome.
you're in love, and you're in love. So good. Yay for love.
We love love.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for listening. And don't forget to check out resources from this episode and more at insightsfromthecouch.org. Thank you, Helen, and we'll see you next time.
Take care, everybody.